They didn't call it abandonment. They called it transitional care. My daughter Sarah used that word as she placed my single suitcase on the sterile vinyl floor of Shady Oaks nursing home. The suitcase looked so small sitting there. 73 years of life reduced to one piece of luggage that didn't even require two hands to carry. "It's just for a little while, Mom, while we get the house sorted." The lie was so smooth it barely made a sound as it slipped from her lips. Sarah had perfected that tone, the one that made cruelty sound like kindness, that made betrayal sound like concern. She stood there in her expensive coat, checking her watch, already mentally gone while I was still trying to understand what was happening to me. My son-in-law Mark flanked her like a bodyguard, his face a mask of cold efficiency. He had the look of a man conducting business, not a man saying goodbye to his wife's mother. When I reached for my purse, my lifeline, my independence, my proof that I was still a person who could make choices, his hand intercepted mine with surgical precision. "My wallet, Sarah. I'll need my cards." The words came out smaller than I intended, already diminished by the fluorescent lighting and the smell of industrial disinfectant that seemed to cling to everything in that place. Mark's smile was thin as paper, sharp as a blade. "All taken care of, Helen. Power of attorney, it's simpler this way." Simpler for whom? If you want to hear how this story ends with the biggest reversal of fortune you've ever heard, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now, because what happened next will shock you. That was the moment I understood the true architecture of my erasure. This wasn't confusion or poor planning or family stress. This was calculated. They had discussed this, planned this, prepared legal documents for this. While I had been living my life trusting in the basic bonds of family, they had been building the machinery of my disposal. The power of attorney wasn't something I had signed in a moment of clarity, thinking ahead to a future need. It was something that had been explained to me as just a precaution during a moment of vulnerability after a minor fall. In case something happens, Mom, just so we can help. Help. They weaponized my own love for them, my desire not to be a burden, and turned it into the very document that would make me powerless. Room 4B. That's what the aide called me when she led me down the hallway that smelled like bleach and defeat. Not Mrs. Evans, not Helen. Room 4B. In the span of 20 minutes, I had been transformed from a person with a name, a history, a bank account, and choices into a number on a door. I couldn't write a check. I couldn't make a phone call without permission. I couldn't leave the building without signing out like a child. I couldn't buy a cup of coffee or a magazine or a birthday card for a friend. Every basic human transaction that proves you exist in the world, that proves you matter, had been stripped away with the stroke of a pen I barely remembered signing. But you have to understand what they took from me to truly understand the magnitude of what happened next. They didn't just take my house at 42 Birch Street. They took my life. That house was the garden where I planted a tree for every grandchild. 7 trees in total, each one chosen specifically for the personality I saw emerging in each little soul. There was Emma's cherry tree that bloomed pink every spring, bright and cheerful like her laugh. There was Michael's sturdy oak, planted the year he started reading chapter books and asking questions about everything. It was the kitchen floor, worn smooth by 50 years of footsteps. Mine rushing to answer a crying baby, my late husband's as he came home from work every evening, children learning to walk by holding onto cabinet handles, grandchildren racing through during holiday visits that filled the house with chaos and joy. It was the master bedroom where I had nursed babies through fevers, where I had held my husband's hand as he died, where I had made every major decision of my adult life. It was the living room where Christmas mornings exploded with wrapping paper and laughter, where we gathered for birthday parties and graduation celebrations and all the small ceremonies that mark a family's journey through time. They took the basement workshop where my husband had built cradles for each grandchild, where his tools still hung in perfect order on the pegboard he'd installed 40 years ago. They took the attic, where every school project, every report card, every photograph that documented our family's history was carefully stored in labeled boxes. They took my history, they took my identity, They took the physical proof that I had lived a life that mattered, that I had loved people and been loved in return, that I had made decisions and created beauty and contributed something meaningful to the world. And they replaced it all with room 4B, a space so small and generic that it could have been anyone's room, anywhere. A place designed for people who were no longer expected to live, only to wait quietly for death without causing inconvenience to anyone. This wasn't the tragic but inevitable result of aging or illness or family strain. This was the cold, systematic erasure of a human being who had become inconvenient. This was the ultimate expression of a love that had terms and conditions, fine print that I had never been allowed to read until it was too late to negotiate. They thought they were writing the end of my story. They had no idea they were actually writing the beginning of theirs. Shady Oaks wasn't the worst nursing home in the city, which somehow made it more insidious. It was clean, properly staffed, and met all the regulatory requirements that allowed families to sleep soundly at night knowing they had chosen quality care for their inconvenient elderly relatives. The food arrived on schedule, bland, overcooked vegetables that had surrendered any pretense of nutrition or flavor, meatloaf that tasted like cardboard soaked in grease, mashed potatoes that came from a box and somehow managed to be both watery and lumpy simultaneously. Every meal was designed not to nourish but to sustain, to keep us functional enough to avoid lawsuits but uninspired enough to remain compliant. The aide spoke to us in the sing-song voice reserved for children and pets. "Time for our medicine, Helen. Did we have a good nap? Let's try to eat all our dinner, shall we?" The plural pronoun was particularly galling, as if I had somehow merged with the institution, become part of a collective that existed only to be managed, rather than individuals who deserved basic respect. The other residents moved through the hallways like ghosts of their former selves. There was Mrs. Patterson, who had been a high school principal for 30 years, now shuffling past in slippers and a hospital gown, muttering about lesson plans for classes she would never teach again. Mr. Kowalski, a former construction foreman who had built half the bridges in the county, now spent his days staring at game shows and asking the same 3 questions about his lunch every 15 minutes. But then there was Hilda Richardson in the bed next to mine, 81 years old, with the sharp eyes of a woman who refused to be diminished by circumstance. Hilda had been a tax attorney before her retirement, and she watched the operations of Shady Oaks with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades identifying fraud and incompetence. "You know what this place really is?" Hilda told me on my 3rd day, as we sat in the common room pretending to enjoy the scheduled entertainment, a 20-something volunteer playing acoustic guitar covers of songs from decades after our youth. "It's a warehouse. We're inventory. They feed us enough to keep us breathing, medicate us enough to keep us quiet, and warehouse us until our families can figure out how to liquidate our assets without feeling guilty about it." I learned the rules quickly, though no one bothered to explain them directly. You discovered them through small humiliations, tiny denials that accumulated like paper cuts until you bled dignity from 1,000 invisible wounds. I asked to use the phone on my 4th day. I wanted to call my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to ask her to water the plants in my kitchen window. The aide at the desk didn't even look up from her own phone. "Family calls only," she said, her thumb scrolling through social media posts. "And they have to initiate." I waited for them to initiate. I waited through dinner, through the evening medication distribution, through the mindless chatter of a television turned up too loud for residents who had given up asking for the volume to be lowered. I waited through the night shift change, through breakfast, through the morning activities that were designed to fill time rather than enrich lives. My family didn't initiate. On my 5th day, I asked again. This time, the aide, a different one, younger, with the same distracted air of someone whose real life existed entirely outside these walls, actually looked at me. "Did your family say you could make calls?" she asked, as if I were a child requesting permission for a sleepover. I'm asking to call my neighbor about my plants. "Sorry, honey, family calls only." And they have to set it up? That was when I understood the full scope of my imprisonment. I couldn't communicate with the outside world without my captor's permission. I couldn't maintain the relationships that had sustained me, couldn't check on the small responsibilities that had given my life meaning, couldn't even perform the basic human function of reaching out to another person when I needed connection. But the moment that truly broke something inside me came a week after my arrival. I was in the common room, staring at a magazine from 2018. Apparently, even the reading material was considered adequate if it was merely present, regardless of relevance, when an aide approached with a cardboard box. "Delivery for room 4B, she announced, setting the box on the plastic table in front of me with the same enthusiasm she might reserve for delivering medical waste. Inside was my old winter coat, the navy blue wool coat I'd owned for 15 years, the one with the torn lining in the right pocket that I'd been meaning to mend for months. Along with it were 3 sweaters I rarely wore, a pair of shoes that had been relegated to the back of my closet, and a small jewelry box containing the costume jewelry I kept for gardening, pieces that were pretty enough to wear while working outside, but not valuable enough to worry about losing. Do you understand what this box represented? Sarah had gone through my closet, my personal space, my private domain, and selected the things she deemed appropriate for my new life. Not my good coat, the cashmere one my husband had given me for our 40th anniversary. Not my real jewelry, the pieces with sentimental value and family history. Not the sweaters I actually liked, the ones that made me feel attractive and confident. She had sent me the damaged coat, the one with the torn lining. She had sent me the clothes I didn't like, the shoes that weren't quite comfortable, the jewelry that was essentially worthless. She had curated my existence down to what she considered adequate for a woman who no longer mattered. It was a message written in fabric and thread, in worn leather and tarnished metal. It said, "You are no longer worth mending. You are no longer worth investment. You are no longer worth anything but the cast-offs, the damaged goods, the things we can spare without missing them." I sat there holding that torn coat, feeling the rough edges of the lining where it had pulled away from the seam, and I understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't temporary care. This wasn't a brief transition while they sorted things out. This was my new reality, carefully constructed by people who had decided that my comfort, my dignity, my basic human needs were optional expenses in their budget of caring. Hilda watched me from across the room as I folded that coat and placed it back in the box. When I looked up, she nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "They're not coming back for you," she said quietly. "The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start planning what you're going to do about it." I didn't know it then, but Hilda had just given me the most valuable gift anyone had offered in years. She had given me permission to stop waiting for rescue and start planning my own salvation. Because while I was sitting in that common room, holding the physical evidence of my family's assessment of my worth, something else was making its way through the postal system, something that would prove that worth isn't determined by the people who discard you, it's determined by the people who remember you when you think you've been forgotten completely. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week and 2 days after the coat incident. I remember because Tuesday was Music Therapy Day, which meant the same young volunteer with her acoustic guitar playing the same rotation of songs that had nothing to do with the music of our generation, positioned myself in the common room's corner chair, the one with the view of the parking lot, holding a magazine from 2019 about celebrities I didn't recognize, promoting products I'd never heard of. The morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. Breakfast at 7:30, medications at 9, and then the slow shuffle of residents to whatever activity had been scheduled to fill the hours until lunch. But this Tuesday, something broke the pattern. Mr. Kellerman approached my chair. In 3 weeks at Shady Oaks, I had seen the administrator exactly twice. Once during my admission interview, and once when Mrs. Patterson had fallen in the bathroom and her family threatened legal action. Mr. Kellerman was a thin man in his 50s who managed the facility like a mid-level corporate office, all efficiency reports and cost containment. He never approached residents directly. We were handled by aides, managed by nurses, supervised by orderlies. We were not the kind of people who warranted his personal attention. "Mrs. Evans?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone unsure he had the right person. A registered letter for you." A registered letter. For room 4B. I hadn't received any mail since my arrival, not so much as a piece of junk mail or a magazine subscription. My mail was being forwarded to Sarah's house. Another small detail of my erasure that I hadn't thought to question until this moment. The envelope was thick, substantial in a way that suggested importance rather than routine correspondence. The paper was expensive linen, cream-colored with a subtle texture that spoke of law firms and serious business. The return address was embossed in deep blue ink, Sterling and Gable, LLC, Attorneys at Law, followed by an address in the financial district downtown. I turned the envelope over in my hands, searching my memory for any connection to this firm. Sterling and Gable. The names meant nothing to me. I had never hired a lawyer, never been involved in any legal proceedings beyond the simple will my husband and I had drawn up 20 years ago with a neighborhood attorney who had since retired. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope, not from age or infirmity, but from the strange electricity of possibility. Inside was a letter, 3 pages of dense legal text on matching letterhead, but also something else. A smaller envelope marked "Personal Note." I started with the legal document, trying to parse the formal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Estate of Arthur Benjamin Shaw, deceased. Primary beneficiary. Assets valued at approximately... The numbers blurred together at first. Too large to process. Too impossible to believe. Then I opened the personal note, written in the careful handwriting of someone who understood that words on paper might be the last communication they would ever have with another human being. "Dear Helen," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have passed away, and my attorneys have located you as I requested. You probably don't remember me, but 23 years ago we spent several afternoons talking in the downtown library. You were researching local history for a community garden project, and I was hiding from a world that had become too difficult to navigate since my wife's death. Arthur Shaw, the quiet man with the sad eyes who had helped me find the Historical Society records I needed. We had talked about books, about gardening, about the way cities change and forget their own stories. He had been recently widowed, I remembered now, lost in grief and struggling to find purpose in a life that had been built around partnership. You listened to me talk about Margaret, my wife, without trying to fix my sadness or hurry me past my grief. You recommended books about healing and hope, but you also sat with me in my sorrow without making it about yourself. You treated a broken old man like he still mattered, like his story was worth hearing. I never forgot your kindness. Over the years, I followed your community work in the local papers, the garden project, your volunteer work at the literacy center, the scholarship fund you established in your husband's name after he passed. You lived a life that mattered, a life that made other people's lives better. I have no family left, Helen. No children, no siblings, no cousins who remember my name. My attorneys have instructions to find you and inform you that I have left you my entire estate. The monetary value is approximately $200 million, but more than that, I am leaving you the power to continue making the world better in whatever way you choose. $200 million. I read that line 3 times, each time thinking I had misunderstood, that there was a decimal point I had missed, that this was some kind of elaborate mistake or cruel joke. But the legal documents were precise, detailed, professionally prepared. Bank account numbers, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, specific instructions for the transfer of assets. I sat in that plastic chair in the common room of Shady Oaks Nursing Home, holding in my hands the proof that I had mattered to someone, that a conversation 23 years ago, a moment of human kindness that I had barely remembered, had planted a seed that had grown into this impossible gift. But more than the money, though God knows the money was staggering, Arthur had given me something infinitely more valuable. He had given me power. He had given me choices. He had given me the ability to write my own ending to a story that others had decided was finished. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I didn't run through the hallways announcing my good fortune to other residents who had their own grief to manage. Instead, I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into its envelope, and placed it in the small drawer of the table beside my chair. For the first time since I had arrived at Shady Oaks, for the first time since Sarah had placed that suitcase on the vinyl floor, for the first time since Mark had confiscated my wallet with his thin smile, I felt the bones of my own spine. I felt the weight of my own presence in the world, the substance of my own agency. I wasn't room 4B anymore. I wasn't a discarded mother or an inconvenient obligation or a problem to be managed. I was a woman with resources, with options, with the power to make decisions that other people would have to live with. I was a secret. And secrets, properly deployed, have the power to change everything. I had work to do, plans to make, a life to reclaim, and a family to educate about the difference between abandoning someone and simply being temporarily inconvenienced by their existence. But first, I needed to be very careful about who I trusted and how I proceeded, because the people who had orchestrated my imprisonment were about to discover that they had made a fundamental miscalculation about who they were dealing with. They thought they were managing a helpless old woman. They had no idea they were about to negotiate with someone who could buy and sell their entire world without affecting her grocery budget. The moment I folded that letter and placed it in my drawer, something fundamental shifted in my relationship with Shady Oaks. The fluorescent lights were still harsh, the disinfectant smell still clung to everything, the bland food still arrived on schedule, but I was no longer a victim of these circumstances. I was a woman conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines. I wasn't a discarded mother anymore. I was a secret worth $200 million. I was a dormant bank account that could spring to life at any moment. I was a silent shareholder in my own fate, who had just discovered she owned controlling interest in the company. Most importantly, I was a ghost in their machine who had just been handed the master key to every door they thought they had locked. But power without planning is just chaos, and I had spent too many years being powerless to waste this opportunity on emotional reactions or impulsive decisions. If I was going to reclaim my life, I needed to do it methodically, carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that the people who had orchestrated my imprisonment would not simply accept my liberation without a fight. The first challenge was communication. I needed legal representation, but I couldn't exactly ask to use the phone to call attorneys while the staff monitored my conversations. I needed to research my options, but the facility's computer access was limited to supervised sessions for residents who wanted to stay connected with family. Ironically, the same family that had cut off my access to the outside world. That's where my years of community volunteering became unexpectedly valuable. I had learned to work within systems, to find allies in unexpected places, to accomplish goals through patience and strategic relationship building rather than direct confrontation. There was Elena Vasquez, a night nurse who worked the 11 to 7 shift. Elena was different from the day staff, older, more experienced, less likely to treat residents like inventory to be managed. She had been a nurse for 30 years, had raised 4 children on her own, and had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from navigating systems that weren't designed to help people like her. I started small. During her rounds, I would ask Elena about her family, her work, her plans for the future. Real questions that required real answers, not the patronizing small talk that usually passed for conversation in this place. I learned that her youngest daughter was studying pre-law at the community college, that Elena herself had always wanted to pursue nursing education, but had never had the time or resources. After 2 weeks of genuine conversation, I made my move. "Elena," I said during one of her late-night medication rounds, "I've been thinking about writing my memoirs. Nothing fancy, just some stories for my grandchildren about what life was like when I was young. Do you think there's a way I could get some computer time to write, maybe during the day shift when things are less busy?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from any staff member since my arrival. "You know, Mrs. Evans, I think that's a wonderful idea. Let me talk to the day supervisor. We have that computer in the activities room that hardly gets used. I'm sure we could arrange something. Within 3 days, I had 2 hours of computer access every Tuesday and Thursday morning, ostensibly to work on my family memoirs. The day supervisor had even praised the initiative as therapeutic and life-affirming. If only she had known what kind of life I was actually affirming. I wasn't writing memoirs, I was drafting my Declaration of Independence. During those precious computer sessions, I researched estate law, elder abuse statutes, and the legal requirements for power of attorney documents. I learned about financial exploitation of elderly individuals, about the difference between legitimate protective measures and unlawful asset seizure, but most importantly, I researched the firm that had contacted me. Sterling and Gable wasn't just any law practice. They specialized in complex estate planning and asset protection for high net worth individuals. Their client list included tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and philanthropists whose names I recognized from newspaper headlines. Arthur Shaw hadn't just left me money, he had left me an arsenal. I needed to contact them, but I couldn't risk using the facility's phone system or having mail delivered to Shady Oaks. Too many people would ask questions, too many hands would touch documents that needed to remain completely confidential until I was ready to deploy them. That's when I remembered the public library downtown, the same library where I had met Arthur Shaw all those years ago. It was only 6 blocks from Shady Oaks, easily reachable during the afternoon outdoor time that was part of the facility's mandatory wellness program. On a Thursday afternoon, I informed the day aide that I wanted to take a walk to get some fresh air and maybe visit the library to see if they still had the local history section. Such a reasonable request from a resident who was demonstrating positive engagement with community resources. The aide barely looked up from her phone as she signed me out. Walking into that library felt like crossing the border into a free country. For the first time in a month, I was surrounded by books, by knowledge, by the quiet energy of people pursuing their own interests and goals. I found a computer terminal in a corner where I could work without being observed, and I composed the most important email I had ever written. Dear Mr. Sterling, I am Helen Evans, and I believe I am the beneficiary referenced in your letter regarding the estate of Arthur Shaw. I am currently in a situation that makes normal communication channels difficult too, and I need to speak with you as soon as possible about managing this inheritance discreetly. I will be at the downtown library every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. for the next 2 weeks. Please respond to this email with a time when we could meet briefly in the library's reading room to discuss next steps. I sent the email and then spent the rest of my library time actually researching local history, just in case anyone asked what I had been doing. When I returned to Shady Oaks an hour later, I felt like a spy returning from a successful mission behind enemy lines. The response came within 24 hours. Andrew Sterling himself, the senior partner, would meet me in the library's reading room that Thursday at 2:30 p.m. He would be carrying a copy of Local Gardens Through the Decades and wearing a blue tie. Professional, discreet, and perfectly calibrated to our cover story. Thursday afternoon, I walked into that library with my heart pounding but my spine straight. There, at a corner table in the reading room, sat a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of quietly expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted about success. Mrs. Evans? He stood as I approached, extending his hand with the respectful gravity appropriate for greeting a significant client. Andrew Sterling, thank you for reaching out. We sat at that library table, surrounded by the quiet rustle of pages and the gentle hum of people pursuing knowledge, and I told him everything. The nursing home, the power of attorney, the systematic seizure of my assets, the complete loss of autonomy. I showed him the inheritance letter, and I watched his expression shift from professional interest to controlled outrage. Mrs. Evans, he said finally, his voice carefully modulated to avoid being overheard, what they've done to you appears to constitute financial elder abuse under state law. But more importantly for our immediate purposes, you are now a woman of considerable means who has been unlawfully deprived of access to her resources. My family can't know about this inheritance yet, I told him. They think I'm powerless, and I need them to continue thinking that while we figure out how to address what they've done." Andrew Sterling smiled. Not the thin, calculating smile I had grown used to from my family, but the satisfied smile of a professional who had just been presented with a particularly interesting challenge. "Mrs. Evans," he said, "by the time we're finished, your family will understand exactly what it costs to underestimate a woman who has spent 73 years learning how to survive in a world that consistently undervalues her capabilities." I walked back to Shady Oaks that afternoon, knowing that I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an ally, I had resources, and most importantly, I had a plan. Phase 1 had been reconnaissance and alliance building, Phase 2 would be psychological warfare, and my family had absolutely no idea what was coming. Andrew Sterling and I had established our communication protocol during that first library meeting. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I would check a specific email account he had set up for me during my memoir writing sessions. But our first tactical decision was brilliantly simple. I was going to call Sarah. Not to beg, not to plead, not to ask for anything. I was going to plant a seed of doubt so small, so seemingly innocent, that she wouldn't even recognize it as a threat until it had grown into something that could destroy her confidence in the very foundation of what she thought she knew about me. I waited until Friday evening, when families are typically relaxed, when guards are down, when a call from the nursing home wouldn't seem like an emergency requiring immediate attention. I used the phone at the nurses' station during shift change, when the staff was distracted with their reports and medication counts. "Sarah? It's Mom." My voice was carefully modulated, warm but not desperate, conversational but not demanding, the tone of a woman who had something interesting to share rather than something desperate to ask for. "Mom, is everything okay? You don't usually call." Already defensive, already positioning herself as the put-upon daughter dealing with an unpredictable mother. "Oh, everything's fine, dear. I just received some interesting mail today and I was wondering if you might know anything about it. A letter from a law firm called Sterling and Gable. Does that name ring a bell for you?" The pause that followed was everything I had hoped for. I could practically hear her mental gears turning, trying to figure out what law firm might be contacting her mother, what legal complications might be emerging, what new problems she might have to manage. "Sterling and Gable? No, Mom, I've never heard of them. What did they want?" The carefully controlled tone couldn't quite hide the edge of anxiety underneath. "Oh, I'm not entirely sure yet. Something about an estate matter, probably just routine paperwork, but you know how these legal things can be. I thought maybe it had something to do with the house sale or the financial arrangements you and Mark have been handling for me." "Estate matter? Mom, what exactly did the letter say?" Now there was no hiding the tension, the need to know, the sudden realization that there might be legal complications she hadn't anticipated. "Well, I don't want to bore you with all the legal language, dear. I'm sure it's nothing important, probably just some procedural matter that will resolve itself. You know how these attorneys like to make everything sound more complicated than it really is." "Mom, I really think you should let me take a look at that letter. Just to make sure everything is in order, maybe I should come by this weekend and we can go through it together." "Oh, would you? That's so thoughtful of you, Sarah. You've been so busy lately. I didn't want to add to your obligations, but if you have time, I suppose that would be helpful." The call ended with Sarah promising to visit Sunday afternoon, the first time she had volunteered to visit since depositing me at Shady Oaks 6 weeks earlier. I hung up the phone knowing that she would spend the entire weekend researching Sterling and Gable, trying to figure out what legal complications might be brewing, what new problems her inconvenient mother might have created. But the real psychological warfare wasn't in what I had said, it was in what I hadn't said. I had mentioned an estate matter without specifying whose estate. I had referenced legal language without quoting any specific terms. I had created a void of information that her anxiety would rush to fill with increasingly dire possibilities. Sarah arrived Sunday afternoon with Mark in tow, both of them carrying the tense energy of people preparing for a crisis. But more telling than their anxiety was the shift in how they treated me. Instead of the patronizing efficiency they had displayed during previous visits, they approached me with something resembling respect, or at least careful attention. Sarah had brought flowers. Cheap grocery store carnations, but flowers nonetheless. Mark actually shook my hand instead of offering his usual perfunctory nod. They asked about my health, my comfort at the facility, whether I needed anything. For the first time since my arrival, they were treating me like a person whose opinions and needs might matter. "So, Mom," Sarah said after we had exhausted the pleasantries, "about that letter you mentioned, from Sterling and Gable?" "Oh yes, the letter." I reached into my small table drawer and withdrew a different envelope entirely, a piece of junk mail I had saved from the facility's daily mail distribution. I have it here somewhere, or did I put it with my other papers? My memory isn't quite what it used to be. I watched Mark's jaw tighten as I made a show of searching through non-existent papers. Sarah's smile became increasingly strained as I appeared to grow more confused about the location of this mysterious legal document. "You know," I said finally, "I think I may have put it in the safe place where I keep important documents, but I'm having trouble remembering exactly where that safe place is. These institutional settings can be so disorienting." "Mom," Sarah said, her voice tight with barely controlled impatience, "this could be important. Legal documents usually require prompt attention. Maybe we should contact the law firm directly and ask them to send another copy." "Oh, do you think so?" "I wouldn't want to bother them unnecessarily, although—" I paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. They did mention something about needing to speak with me in person. Something about verifying my identity and capacity to make legal decisions. The look that passed between Sarah and Mark was everything I had hoped for. Suddenly, the woman they had dismissed as incompetent and legally powerless was being sought out by attorneys for consultation about matters of legal capacity and decision-making authority. "Mom," Mark said carefully, "maybe we should be present when you meet with these attorneys, just to make sure your interests are properly protected." "Protected from what, dear? They seemed very professional in their letter, very respectful. They treated me like someone whose opinion mattered, whose decisions had weight. It was quite refreshing, actually." The visit ended with promises to return soon, offers to help with anything I might need, and barely concealed anxiety about legal complications they couldn't identify or control. As they left, I heard Sarah telling Mark that they needed to research Sterling and Gable immediately, needed to understand what kind of legal firm they were dealing with. Over the following weeks, their behavior toward me underwent a complete transformation. Phone calls that had ceased entirely suddenly resumed. Sarah began visiting twice a week, bringing small gifts and asking careful questions about my mental state, my memory, my understanding of legal and financial matters. They were probing, testing, trying to determine whether I was still the easily manipulated woman they had deposited at Shady Oaks, or whether something had changed. They needed to know whether I was still the powerless victim of their financial machinations, or whether I had somehow acquired the resources and legal representation that could threaten their carefully constructed narrative. During one particularly transparent visit, Sarah brought photo albums, pictures of my grandchildren, family gatherings, holidays from years past. "I thought you might enjoy looking through these, Mom, remembering happier times when we were all together." The subtext was clear. Remember how much you need us. Remember how much you miss being part of this family. Remember that your inclusion in these happy memories depends on your continued cooperation with our management of your life. I looked through those albums with appropriate nostalgia, made the expected comments about how the children had grown, how time had passed so quickly. But then I said something that I knew would lodge in her consciousness like a splinter. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what people leave behind, what really matters in the end. It's interesting how some people spend their whole lives accumulating things, and others spend their lives accumulating the kind of relationships that last." I could see her processing this statement, trying to determine whether it was the innocent musing of an elderly woman or a pointed commentary on her own choices. The uncertainty was exactly what I wanted. The growing suspicion that the woman she thought she had neutralized might still possess weapons she hadn't accounted for. Through Andrew Sterling's discreet investigations, I learned what they had been doing with my house, my assets, my carefully accumulated life savings. The house had been listed for sale within 2 weeks of my arrival at Shady Oaks. My investment accounts had been liquidated and transferred to accounts they controlled. My car had been sold, my personal belongings sorted through and distributed or discarded, according to their assessment of value. They hadn't waited to see if I would recover, hadn't considered that my placement might truly be temporary, hadn't even pretended that my preferences or wishes factored into their decisions. They had treated my life like a estate sale, liquidating my existence with the same emotional detachment they might bring to cleaning out a storage unit. But now, for the first time since they had orchestrated my imprisonment, they were uncertain. They had encountered a variable they couldn't control, a legal complication they couldn't manage, a version of me that didn't fit their comfortable narrative of helpless victim requiring their benevolent management. I let them wonder. I let them research Sterling and Gable and discover that it was indeed a highly respected firm specializing in complex estate planning for wealthy clients. I let them imagine what kind of legal matter might have attracted such expensive attention to their supposedly powerless mother. Because while they were busy wondering, Andrew Sterling and I were busy planning. And what we were planning would teach them that the woman they had underestimated possessed resources they had never imagined, and a capacity for strategic thinking they had consistently dismissed. They thought they were managing a confused old woman. They had no idea they were being outmaneuvered by someone who had finally learned to value herself as much as she had always valued them. By the 3rd week of their sudden renewed interest in my welfare, Andrew Sterling and I had completed our legal strategy. What we had discovered through his investigations went far beyond simple financial opportunism. It constituted a systematic pattern of elder abuse that violated both state and federal laws. The power of attorney documents that had been used to seize control of my assets contained irregularities that any competent attorney should have caught. The signatures were dated during a period when I had been on pain medication following my fall, a time when my capacity to understand complex legal documents was demonstrably compromised. More damning, the witnesses to my signature included Mark himself and Sarah's close friend, creating a clear conflict of interest that invalidated the entire document. But Andrew's most devastating discovery came through his examination of the timeline of their actions. They had begun liquidating my assets within 48 hours of my arrival at Shady Oaks, before any medical professional had declared me incompetent, before any court had reviewed my capacity, before there was any legal justification for assuming permanent guardianship of my financial affairs. Mrs. Evans, Andrew had told me during one of our library meetings, they didn't place you in that facility because they believed you needed care. They placed you there because they needed you out of the way while they dismantled your financial independence. This wasn't family concern. This was a calculated heist. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in family court, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that felt oddly appropriate for exposing the cold calculations that had brought us all there. I had spent the previous evening with Elena, who had helped me choose clothing that projected competence and dignity rather than institutional dependence. Sarah and Mark arrived with their attorney, a nervous young man who clearly hadn't expected to be defending a case this complex when he agreed to handle what he probably thought would be routine elder care paperwork. They sat on one side of the courtroom, whispering urgently among themselves, their confidence visibly eroding as they realized the scope of what they were facing. Judge Patricia Hoffman was a woman in her 60s who had built her career on family law cases involving vulnerable adults. She had the kind of sharp, no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of seeing through manipulation and identifying the difference between genuine concern and self-serving opportunism. Andrew opened with a presentation that was devastating in its calm precision. He laid out the timeline of events: my minor fall, the rushed power of attorney signing while I was medicated, my placement in the nursing home, and the immediate liquidation of my assets. Each document was presented chronologically, creating an undeniable narrative of planned financial abuse. "Your Honor," Andrew said, his voice carrying the authority of someone presenting incontrovertible facts, "Mrs. Evans was not placed in institutional care because of medical necessity. She was placed there because the defendants needed her physically removed from her home while they gained access to and liquidated her assets. The speed and scope of their financial actions demonstrate premeditation, not reactive concern for her welfare." Their attorney's response was exactly what I had expected: appeals to family concern, references to my declining capacity, vague assertions about acting in my best interests. But when pressed for specific medical evidence of my incompetence, for documentation of the emergent danger that had required immediate intervention, for any professional assessment that had recommended institutional care, he had nothing. Andrew presented the independent medical evaluation that had been conducted the previous week by Dr. Patricia Reyes, a geriatric specialist with 30 years of experience. Dr. Reyes had found me to be mentally acute, physically capable of independent living, and showing no signs of the cognitive decline that would justify guardianship or asset management by family members. Mrs. Evans demonstrates excellent cognitive function, clear understanding of complex financial and legal concepts, and full capacity for independent decision-making, Dr. Reyes had written in her report. There is no medical justification for the current restrictions on her autonomy or the third-party management of her financial affairs. But the moment that truly shifted the entire proceeding came when Judge Hoffman asked to speak with me directly. Sarah and Mark's attorney had been arguing that I was easily confused, potentially manipulated by unscrupulous legal counsel, not fully competent to understand the implications of my own case. "Mrs. Evans," Judge Hoffman said, her voice respectful but direct, "I need to understand your perspective on these proceedings. Do you believe you understood what you were signing when you executed the power of attorney documents in question?" I looked directly at the judge, then at Sarah and Mark, then back to the judge. My voice was steady, my words carefully chosen but delivered with the authority of someone who had finally found her voice again. "Your Honor, I wasn't asked to sign those documents. I was told I had already agreed to them. There is a world of difference between those two things." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Hoffman leaned forward slightly, her attention completely focused on my words. "I was informed that arrangements had been made for my care while I recovered from a minor fall. I was told that temporary paperwork had been prepared to make sure bills could be paid and decisions could be made if necessary. I was not told that I was signing away my autonomy, my financial independence, and my right to live in my own home. I was not asked whether I wanted to sell my house, liquidate my investments, or live in an institution. These decisions were made for me by people who assured me they were acting in my best interests while systematically dismantling every aspect of my independent life. When I asked questions about these arrangements, I was told not to worry about such complicated matters. When I expressed concern about the speed of these changes, I was told that family knows what's best. When I requested access to my own financial accounts, I was told that everything was being handled appropriately. Your Honor, competent adults are not told what decisions have been made for them. They are asked what decisions they would like to make for themselves. The treatment I received was not the treatment of someone whose family respected her capacity and judgment. It was the treatment of someone whose family had already decided that her capacity and judgment were irrelevant to their plans. Judge Hoffman nodded slowly, and I could see in her expression the recognition of a pattern she had encountered many times before. Families who confused their own convenience with their elders' best interests, who mistook control for care. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Hoffman addressed Sarah and Mark's attorney, Your clients seem to have acted with remarkable speed in implementing what they characterize as emergency protective measures. Can you explain why the sale of Mrs. Evans' home was initiated before any medical professional had declared such a sale necessary? The young attorney fumbled through explanations about market conditions and avoiding complications, but his answers only highlighted the fact that financial considerations, not medical ones, had driven their decision-making process. Judge Hoffman's ruling was swift and comprehensive. The power of attorney documents were declared invalid due to improper execution and conflict of interest. All financial transactions conducted under the authority of these documents were subject to immediate review and potential reversal. Most importantly, I was declared fully competent to manage my own affairs and make my own decisions about my living arrangements. Mrs. Evans, Judge Hoffman said directly to me, you are free to leave your current residence immediately if you so choose. You have full access to all accounts and assets that were improperly restricted. Any future attempts to limit your autonomy without proper medical and legal justification will be considered contempt of this court. As we filed out of that courtroom, I caught Sarah's eye for just a moment. The look on her face was one I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but genuine shock at discovering that the woman she had dismissed as powerless had possessed the resources and intelligence to outmaneuver her completely. They had built their entire strategy on the assumption that I would remain isolated, confused, and dependent on their version of events. They never considered that I might have allies they didn't know about, resources they couldn't control, and a capacity for strategic thinking that they had consistently underestimated. Justice, I learned that day, doesn't always come with dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly, methodically, through the careful application of facts and law by people who understand that respect for human dignity isn't optional, it's required. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, justice comes with a $200 million inheritance that gives you the power to ensure that it sticks. The morning after the court ruling, I woke up in room 4B for the last time. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, the disinfectant smell still clung to everything, but the space no longer held any power over me. I was no longer a resident of Shady Oaks. I was a guest who could check out whenever she chose. I didn't pack in a rush or make grand announcements. Instead, I moved with the same careful precision that had served me throughout this entire ordeal. Andrew Sterling had arranged for a car service to collect me at 10 o'clock, but first, I had some quiet business to conclude. Elena was finishing her night shift when I found her in the meditation room updating charts for the day staff. She looked up as I entered, and I could see in her expression that she already knew something had changed. Mrs. Evans, you look different this morning. Elena, I wanted to thank you for your kindness over these past weeks. You treated me like a person when others saw only a problem to be managed. I handed her an envelope that Andrew had prepared. Not money, which would have been inappropriate and possibly problematic for her employment, but something more valuable. This is the contact information for a scholarship fund that helps healthcare workers pursue additional education. Your daughter's pre-law studies, your own interest in nursing education. Dreams shouldn't be deferred indefinitely because of financial constraints. Elena opened the envelope and read the letter inside, her eyes widening as she realized what I was offering. Mrs. Evans, I don't understand. How did you— Sometimes life surprises us with unexpected opportunities, Elena. The scholarship fund is real, the opportunity is genuine, and you've earned it through your compassion and professionalism. You saw people where others saw only patience. I didn't tell her about the inheritance. That wasn't her burden to carry or secret to keep. But I made sure she understood that kindness, genuine human kindness, has value that extends far beyond the moment it's given. My final act at Shady Oaks was to visit Hilda Richardson, who was in the common room working on a crossword puzzle and observing the morning medication distribution with her usual sharp attention to institutional inefficiencies. "Well, well," Hilda said as I approached her chair. "Someone looks like she's about to take flight. I assume yesterday's legal proceedings went in your favor?" I should have known that Hilda had been tracking my activities. Nothing happened at Shady Oaks without her notice. And a resident who suddenly acquired high-powered legal representation was exactly the kind of development that would capture her attorney's instincts. "Hilda, I'm leaving today, but I wanted you to have this." I handed her Andrew Sterling's business card. "If you ever need legal consultation about your own situation, or if you encounter other residents who might benefit from professional advocacy, this firm specializes in protecting the rights of older adults." Hilda studied the card with the same careful attention she had once given to tax documents and legal briefs. "Sterling and Gable. Expensive firm, very expensive. Either you've been hiding significant assets, Helen, or you've recently acquired some. Let's just say that sometimes the universe corrects its own imbalances, Hilda. Sometimes people who have been forgotten remember us in ways we never expected." "Good for you, Helen. Give them hell on the outside." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "And if that inheritance is as substantial as I suspect, remember that the best revenge is living well enough to make their neglect look like the poor investment it always was." At exactly 10 o'clock, I walked through the front doors of Shady Oaks Nursing Home carrying the same small suitcase that had arrived with me 2 months earlier, but everything else about my departure was different. I wasn't being transported by family members who saw me as a burden. I was being collected by a professional driver who treated me with the respect due to a valued client. The car that waited for me wasn't a practical family sedan chosen for its efficiency in moving inconvenient relatives. It was a comfortable luxury vehicle that spoke to dignity, choice, and the financial independence to make decisions based on preference rather than necessity. Andrew had been characteristically thorough in his arrangements. I wasn't being taken to a hotel or temporary housing while we sorted out long-term plans. He had already identified and secured the perfect property. A small cottage on Lake Winnebago, about 40 minutes from the city, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that feeds the soul rather than draining it. The cottage appeared through the trees like something from a storybook: white clapboard siding with green shutters, a wraparound porch that begged for morning coffee and evening reflection, gardens that had been lovingly maintained by the previous owner, who had recently moved to be closer to her own grandchildren. The driver handed me a set of keys, not a single key for a room that could be locked from the outside, but a full set of keys that represented autonomy, choice, and the fundamental right to control access to my own space. The key was cold and heavy in my hand. My hand. I turned the lock myself, opened the door myself, stepped across the threshold of a space that belonged to me and no one else. The silence that greeted me wasn't the silence of neglect or abandonment. It was the silence of peace, of possibility, of a life waiting to be lived according to my own values and preferences. The cottage was furnished simply but beautifully. Comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of the lake view, bookshelves waiting to be filled with stories I chose to read, a kitchen designed for someone who enjoyed cooking rather than someone who simply needed to be fed. Every room spoke to the possibility of making choices based on pleasure and preference rather than efficiency and cost containment. The first thing I did was make myself a cup of tea. Not institutional tea served at a prescribed time in a paper cup, but real tea, loose leaves steeped in a proper ceramic pot, served in a china cup that felt substantial and beautiful in my hands. I carried that cup to the porch and sat in a wicker chair that faced the lake, watching the afternoon light dance on water that moved according to wind and weather rather than institutional schedules. Then I opened the leather journal that Andrew had left for me on the kitchen counter, a gift to commemorate what he called my graduation from victim to victor. The first page was blank, waiting for whatever story I chose to write next. I picked up the pen that lay beside the journal and wrote the first entry in my new life. Today, I began. Not today I was rescued, or today I was vindicated, or today I got revenge. Simply, today I began. Because that's what this was. Not the end of an ordeal, but the beginning of a life lived according to my own values, my own choices, my own understanding of what makes existence meaningful rather than merely tolerable. I sat on that porch until the sun set over Lake Winnebago, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to deep purple, and I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't waiting for permission to make a phone call, waiting for someone else to decide what I should eat, waiting for a family visit that might or might not happen according to their convenience. I was simply being present in my own life, making choices about how to spend my time based on my own preferences and interests. The cottage had a small boat dock, and I found myself planning morning walks along the water's edge. The kitchen had a window that looked out over the garden, and I imagined growing herbs and vegetables according to my own schedule and taste. But most importantly, I realized that I was no longer afraid. For months, I had been afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of seeming ungrateful, afraid of causing problems for people who had convinced me that my very existence was an inconvenience they were generously managing. That fear was gone. When you discover that you possess resources people never imagined you had, when you realize that your capacity for strategic thinking exceeds their capacity for manipulation, when you understand that your worth isn't determined by their assessment of your value, fear becomes irrelevant. I was 73 years old, sitting on the porch of a cottage I owned, drinking tea from china I had chosen, planning a life that reflected my values and preferences rather than other people's convenience. For the first time in my adult life, I was answerable only to myself. And that, I discovered, was the most valuable inheritance of all. It's been 18 months since I walked out of Shady Oaks nursing home with a single suitcase and a secret worth $200 million. 18 months since I discovered that the people who had written me off as powerless had fundamentally miscalculated who they were dealing with. And I want to tell you what I've learned, not just about family betrayal or financial abuse or the legal system, but about the extraordinary power that lies dormant in people who have been convinced they no longer matter. If you are watching this story, if you recognize yourself in the woman who was dismissed and discarded, if you have ever been made to feel like your voice doesn't matter, your choices don't count, your very existence is an inconvenience that others must manage, I need you to hear me. Really hear me. You are not too old to start over. You are not too powerless to fight back. You are not too dependent to declare independence. You are not too forgotten to matter. The people who benefit from your silence, your compliance, your grateful acceptance of whatever scraps of dignity they're willing to offer, those people have a vested interest in convincing you that resistance is futile. They are wrong, and I am living proof that they are wrong. I spent 73 years believing that my worth was determined by how useful I was to other people, how little trouble I caused, how gracefully I accepted whatever role others assigned to me. I measured my success as a mother by how much my children needed me, as a grandmother by how welcome I felt at family gatherings, as a human being by how much others valued my presence. That's the trap they set for us, especially for women, especially for older women. We're taught that our value lies in our service to others, that love is measured by sacrifice, that questioning treatment that diminishes us is selfish and ungrateful. We're conditioned to believe that our needs are optional, our preferences are inconvenient, our boundaries are suggestions that can be overruled by people who claim to know what's best for us. But here's what I discovered when I finally stopped accepting the unacceptable. The love that requires you to diminish yourself isn't love at all. It's exploitation wrapped in the language of care. It's control disguised as concern. It's the systematic erosion of your autonomy dressed up as family responsibility. Real love, the kind worth having, the kind worth fighting for, doesn't require you to become smaller so others can feel bigger. Real love celebrates your capabilities instead of managing them. Real love asks what you want instead of telling you what you need. Real love treats your voice as valuable instead of treating your silence as convenient. You are not a burden. You are a person with a lifetime of accumulated wisdom, experience, and insight. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a human being deserving of respect, dignity, and the fundamental right to make decisions about your own life. You are not an inconvenience to be managed. You are someone whose story, whose perspective, whose very existence adds value to the world. But here's the crucial part, the part that took me 7 decades to understand. Other people's assessment of your worth is not the final word on your value. Their decision to dismiss you doesn't diminish you. Their choice to underestimate you doesn't limit you. Their convenience in writing you off doesn't erase you. You have more strength than you realize, more options than you know, more allies than you imagine. The world is full of people who will value what you have to offer, who will treat your voice as important, who will see your independence as something to celebrate rather than something to fear. I know what it feels like to believe you have no choices left, that the people who control your resources also control your future, that resistance will only make things worse. I know the exhaustion of fighting for basic respect from people who should offer it freely. I know the isolation of being surrounded by family who see you as an obligation rather than a person they cherish. But I also know what it feels like to discover that you possess resources people never imagined, capabilities they consistently underestimated, and a capacity for strategic thinking that exceeds their ability to manipulate and control. I know the profound satisfaction of watching people who dismissed you realize they made a fundamental error in calculation. Your story is not over. Your capacity for growth, change, and transformation doesn't expire on some arbitrary birthday. Your right to dignity, respect, and self-determination doesn't become negotiable just because you need more support than you used to, just because your body moves slower than it once did, just because you sometimes need help with things you used to manage independently. We live in a culture that treats aging like a disease, that sees dependence as failure, that confuses needing support with losing value. But needing help doesn't make you helpless. Requiring assistance doesn't require surrender. Accepting care doesn't mean accepting control. If you are being financially exploited, there are laws to protect you and lawyers who specialize in elder abuse. If you are being isolated and controlled, there are advocates who understand these patterns and can help you navigate toward freedom. If you are being told that your preferences don't matter, there are people who will affirm that they absolutely do matter. Document everything, keep records. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if people tell you you're being paranoid or difficult. Reach out to professionals who don't have a financial stake in keeping you compliant and manageable. Build relationships outside the family system that has decided you're inconvenient. Find the Elena Vasquez in your situation, the person who sees you as human rather than just a patient or a problem. Find the Hilda Richardson who will tell you the truth about what's happening, even when it's uncomfortable. Find the Andrew Sterling who will take your case seriously and fight for your rights with professional skill and personal commitment. And most importantly, find your way back to valuing yourself as much as you have always valued others. Find your way back to believing that your preferences matter. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your choices have weight and meaning. Find your way back to understanding that you are worth fighting for, even if you have to be the one doing the fighting. I live now in a cottage by a lake, surrounded by books I choose to read, eating food I enjoy preparing, spending my time on activities that bring me pleasure and purpose. I have friends who appreciate my company, interests that feed my soul, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that every choice I make reflects my own values and preferences. Sarah and Mark never did figure out how their powerless, forgotten mother acquired the resources to outmaneuver them so completely. They never understood that the woman they had dismissed had spent decades building relationships, earning respect, and demonstrating the kind of character that inspires loyalty and affection. Arthur Shaw didn't leave me $200 million because I was wealthy or connected or important in the world's eyes. He left it to me because 23 years ago, I treated a grieving widower like a human being whose story mattered, whose pain deserved acknowledgement, whose healing was worth supporting. That's the real inheritance, the one that money can't buy and manipulation can't steal, the accumulated wealth of genuine human connections, of treating people with dignity, regardless of what they can do for you, of remembering that everyone's story has value, even when the world has forgotten their name. If you enjoyed this story of discovering that it's never too late to reclaim your power, to assert your worth, to refuse to be written off by people who have confused your kindness with weakness, then I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. There are so many of us learning to value ourselves as much as we value others, learning to set boundaries that protect our dignity, learning that the people who truly love us will celebrate our strength rather than exploit our vulnerabilities. We need to know we're not alone in choosing ourselves for once. They thought abandoning me in that nursing home would be the end of my story. They thought seizing my assets would leave me powerless. They thought isolating me from the outside world would make me dependent on their version of reality. But they were wrong. Catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. It wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. It wasn't the moment I lost power. It was the moment I discovered how much power I actually possessed. It wasn't when I became dependent on them. It was when I learned to depend on myself in ways I never imagined possible. And your story isn't over either. Your power isn't gone. It's just been sleeping, waiting for you to remember that you deserve better than whatever scraps of dignity others are willing to offer. Your voice isn't silent. It's just been waiting for you to remember that it has value, that it deserves to be heard, that it can change everything when you finally decide to use it. Today can be the day you begin. Today can be the day you stop accepting the unacceptable and start demanding the respect you've always deserved. Today can be the day you remember that your story is still being written, and you get to hold the pen. The cottage is quiet now, peaceful in the way that comes from living life on your own terms. The lake reflects the evening sky, and I can hear the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. Nature keeping its own schedule, following its own rhythm, answerable to nothing but the ancient patterns that govern moon and tide. There's room here for everyone who's ready to come home to themselves. The water's fine, and the view is spectacular.